I had driven for 11 straight hours to say goodbye to my brother. But what awaited me was not just grief. It was a scheme to steal millions of dollars from his own family. The overwhelming scent of lavender mixed with the smell of hospital disinfectant, creating a suffocating blend. I stood outside the intensive care room of the nursing home. The steady cold clicking of the oxygen machine sounded like a clock counting down Hollis's remaining time. My brother lay there barely breathing, thin and frail. The door swung open. Cale walked in. He carried with him a strong wave of expensive airport cologne, the kind of luxurious fragrance meant to conceal the rot of a guilty conscience. He wore a perfectly pressed suit. His dress shoes gleamed. There was not a single wrinkle on the clothes of a son who had supposedly rushed home on the first flight to see his father one last time. He stepped to the bedside, his face strained to appear sorrowful. He sniffled. He wiped away tears. But his eyes were not fixed on the father who was dying before him. Those sharp eyes could not stay still, darting back and forth as though plotting something. Then he turned to me. His voice dropped to a whisper, urgent, impatient. He asked me about the legal procedures. He asked about inheritance rights. He wanted to know where the property documents were being kept. My brother had not even taken his last breath, and his only son was already thinking about dividing up the estate. The look in his eyes was like a door slamming shut on every principle of human decency. My chest tightened. A chill ran down my spine. My instincts told me that something was terribly wrong in this place. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, a few snacks, and get comfortable. And remember, the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and subscribe, you're going to enjoy this one. That night, the nursing home hallway was swallowed by deep darkness. Dim fluorescent lights cast a pale glow across the cold tile floor. I could not sleep. My mind was consumed by Cale's behavior and the barrage of questions he had asked earlier. I decided to step outside for some air. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the silent corridor. The only other noise was the steady clicking drifting from the patients' rooms. A small figure suddenly emerged from the shadows at the end of the hallway. It was Esther Pebberly. She was a frail, elderly woman with silver-white hair and deeply sunken eyes filled with fear. She glanced nervously around as if she were hiding from some unseen force. Then she approached me. Her thin, trembling hand clutched my arm tightly. The icy touch of her fingers seeped through my sleeve and sent a shiver down my spine. She pulled me into a secluded corner beneath the stairwell. Her voice was barely above a whisper, urgent, saturated with fear. She told me that her room was right next to Hollis's. The previous night she had heard everything. Hollis had been delirious with a high fever. He had cried and begged repeatedly. He was terrified about the will he had signed. He kept talking about the terrible things the boy would do once he was gone. The boy he was talking about was Cale. Esther looked directly into my eyes. Her voice caught in her throat. She told me to be careful. Cale was not the devoted son everyone believed him to be. He had secretly met with a doctor. He had pressured Hollis into signing a stack of documents while he was drifting in and out of consciousness under the effects of pain medication. Esther began trembling uncontrollably as she described the look in Cale's eyes that day. It was not the look of a human being. It was the look of a predator. Esther's story hit me like a bucket of ice water. Every suspicion I had felt earlier that evening had now been confirmed. A horrifying scheme was unfolding beside my brother's hospital bed. I clenched my fists. The fire of anger inside me began to burn. I had to uncover the truth before it was too late, but I had no idea that the trap Cale had prepared was even more terrifying than I could imagine. He did not want only the money. He wanted to erase anyone who stood in his way. The question was, what secret was hidden inside the documents Hollis had been forced to sign? The next morning, Cale invited me to a coffee shop across the street from the nursing home. He arrived, looking as polished and sophisticated as ever. His white dress shirt was spotless. He pulled out a chair for me himself and ordered 2 black coffees. Then he began his performance. His face drooped with carefully crafted concern. His voice trembled with what sounded like heartfelt worry about his father's estate. He let out a long sigh and said he had not slept all night because he was thinking about the family's future. Soon he brought up my brother's $700,000 lakeside cabin. It was the home that had stood peacefully by the lake where Bryony had grown up. Cale looked at me with manufactured sincerity. He spoke about the property as if it were some enormous burden, a burden he would have to carry on behalf of his younger sister. He said Brienne was still too young. She did not understand how to manage money. If she inherited the cabin, he claimed she would quickly be manipulated and stripped of everything by opportunists. He wanted to step in and take responsibility for protecting the property for her. I sat in silence. Steam rose from the coffee on the table, but my blood ran cold. His words made me sick. The sheer audacity of the man was beyond my ability to tolerate. I remembered Esther's whispered warning at 2 o'clock that morning. The mask of the devoted son was beginning to crack before my eyes. Beneath that respectable exterior lurked a bottomless greed. He was trying to push his own sister out of the inheritance left behind by their dying father. I forced myself to suppress the anger threatening to erupt. I did not expose him immediately. I wanted to see just how far this fox intended to carry his act. I took a sip of the bitter coffee. Then I looked directly into his eyes and gave a slight nod. I told him to continue explaining his plan. Cale thought I had taken the bait. A flash of triumph lit up his eyes. Slowly, he opened an expensive leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of documents and slid them across the table toward me. He told me all I needed to do was sign as a witness. I lowered my gaze to the first lines on the page. My heart suddenly began pounding in my chest. These were not ordinary asset management documents as he had tried to suggest. The hidden clauses buried inside them were something far darker, something far more dangerous. What lay behind those pages was not a simple transfer of responsibility. It was a deadly trap. The stack of documents lay cold and motionless on the wooden table. Cale slid an expensive fountain pen toward me. He smiled encouragingly. His voice was sweet as honey. He told me I only needed to sign quickly in the witness section to help finalize the paperwork for his father. I did not reach for the pen. Ever since I was young, I had a habit of reading every word carefully, including the smallest print. I turned the pages one by one. The soft rustling of paper echoed through the quiet coffee shop. My eyes stopped at the property transfer section. My mind nearly exploded. This was not an ordinary power of attorney document. It was a transfer agreement granting full ownership of the $700,000 cabin directly to Cale. And it did not stop there. The next page was a document granting him absolute financial authority. He would have complete control over every one of Hollis's bank accounts. The deadliest blow was hidden in the final document. It was a beneficiary change form for a $400,000 insurance policy. Bryony's name had been completely crossed out. In its place was Cale's. The total value was $1.1 million. Every dollar my brother had worked for throughout his life would belong to him. My chest tightened with rage. A perfect $1.1 million trap had already been prepared. He was exploiting his father's helpless condition to steal the last source of security from his own sister. I looked up at him. Cale calmly sipped his coffee. Not a single expression changed on his face. That chilling composure told me he had been planning this for a very long time. He thought I was just a confused old man from a small town. He thought I would be easily manipulated by his hypocritical speeches and false concern. I forced myself to control my breathing and keep my hands from trembling with anger. Then I placed the documents back on the table. I pushed the fountain pen toward him. My voice dropped low, cold, firm. I told him I needed to verify one final detail before signing anything. Cale raised an eyebrow. For the first time, impatience began to show on his face. What he did not know was that I had already made my decision. I was going to expose him in front of Hollis's hospital bed. I rose from my chair and told him to come back to the nursing home with me. I was about to unleash a secret weapon he could never have anticipated. One phone call that would completely change the course of this battle. We returned to Hollis's room. The atmosphere inside was suffocating. My brother still lay motionless in the bed. The oxygen machine continued its steady clicking rhythm. I stood at the foot of the bed. Then I looked directly into Cale's eyes and made a demand. I wanted to call my niece Brienne immediately. I wanted her to hear firsthand about these decisions that would completely change her father's estate plans. My frustration surged the moment I saw his reaction. The color drained from Cale's polished face. He immediately stepped between me and the telephone on the table. He tried everything he could to delay the call. His voice began to rise. He said I was exhausted and sleep-deprived, causing me to imagine problems that did not exist. He claimed Bryony was busy at school and should not be bothered with adult matters. He deliberately used his larger frame to force me backward. The mask was gone. Every trace of his false politeness had disappeared. All that remained was selfishness and a desperate hunger to seize the inheritance at any cost. I refused to argue with him. Instead, I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket. I dialed Bryony's number and switched the call to speakerphone. The phone rang 3 times before connecting. Bryony's voice filled the room. Her tone was youthful and clear, yet tinged with exhaustion. I asked her whether she knew anything about the transfer of the lakeside cabin and the $400,000 insurance fund. The room seemed to freeze. There was silence on the other end for several seconds. Then Bryony's shocked voice broke through. She burst into tears when she learned that she had been removed from her father's estate documents. She had absolutely no knowledge of the stack of papers Cale was carrying. She said her father had always promised that the cabin would belong to her. Cale realized the truth was out. He stopped pretending to be polite. He lunged forward and tried to snatch the phone from my hand. His eyes were streaked with red veins burning with rage. The real confrontation had begun. Right there, in front of his dying father. But Cale had no idea that deceiving Bryony was only the tip of the iceberg. There were darker secrets hidden beneath the surface, and those secrets were about to drag him into a far deeper disaster than he could possibly imagine. We returned to Hollis's room. The atmosphere inside was suffocating. My brother still lay motionless in the bed. The oxygen machine continued its steady clicking rhythm. I stood at the foot of the bed. Then I looked directly into Cale's eyes and made a demand. I wanted to call my niece Bryony immediately. I wanted her to hear firsthand about these decisions that would completely change her father's estate plans. My frustration surged the moment I saw his reaction. The color drained from Cale's polished face. He immediately stepped between me and the telephone on the table. He tried everything he could to delay the call. His voice began to rise. He said I was exhausted and sleep-deprived, causing me to imagine problems that did not exist. He claimed Bryony was busy at school and should not be bothered with adult matters. He deliberately used his larger frame to force me backward. The mask was gone. Every trace of his false politeness had disappeared. All that remained was selfishness and a desperate hunger to seize the inheritance at any cost. I refused to argue with him. Instead, I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket. I dialed Bryony's number and switched the call to speakerphone. The phone rang 3 times before connecting. Bryony's voice filled the room. Her tone was youthful and clear, yet tinged with exhaustion. I asked her whether she knew anything about the transfer of the lakeside cabin and the $400,000 insurance fund. The room seemed to freeze. There was silence on the other end for several seconds. Then Bryony's shocked voice broke through. She burst into tears when she learned that she had been removed from her father's estate documents. She had absolutely no knowledge of the stack of papers Cale was carrying. She said her father had always promised that the cabin would belong to her. Cale realized the truth was out. He stopped pretending to be polite. He lunged forward and tried to snatch the phone from my hand. His eyes were streaked with red veins burning with rage. The real confrontation had begun. Right there, in front of his dying father. But Cale had no idea that deceiving Bryony was only the tip of the iceberg. There were darker secrets hidden beneath the surface, and those secrets were about to drag him into a far deeper disaster than he could possibly imagine. If you've stayed with the story this far, then it has probably stirred some emotions in you. Please help us with one small and quick thing: like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and tell me your prediction for how the story will end, to see if you're right. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. I ended the call and walked to Hollis's bedside. I took hold of my brother's thin, icy hand. I leaned close and whispered into his ear that Cale was gone. I told him he could rest now. Suddenly, Hollis's fingers twitched. Slowly, he opened his eyes. The vacant haze caused by medication was gone. There was a strange clarity in them. He tried to move his lips, but no words came out. Instead, he used what little strength he had left to point toward his pillow. I immediately understood. I slid my hand beneath it. My fingers touched something hard, wrapped carefully in gauze. It was not money. It was not jewelry. It was a rusty key. A key leading to another terrible secret that Cale had been desperately searching for all this time. I pulled the rusty key from the gauze beneath Hollis's pillow. The cold metal rested in the palm of my hand. I looked at my brother. His eyes were filled with peace. It was as though a crushing burden he had carried for years had finally been lifted. At that moment, Bryony rushed into the room. Her clothes were disheveled. Tears streaked her pale face. She hurried to the bedside and gripped her father's other hand. The room seemed to stand still. The scent of lavender faded away. Only the cold smell of the hospital remained. The oxygen machine clicked more slowly with each passing moment. Hollis looked at me. Then he looked at Bryony. A faint smile appeared on his gaunt face. In that moment he gathered every ounce of strength he had left and squeezed both our hands. The gesture felt like a silent thank you, a final expression of gratitude for protecting his last wishes. He was placing Bryony's future in my hands. He was entrusting his faith to his younger brother. Then the long, piercing tone of the heart monitor shattered the silence. The line on the screen flattened into a single unbroken streak. Hollis was gone. He took his final breath with Bryony and me beside him. Bryony collapsed against her father's chest and sobbed uncontrollably. I stood frozen. Hot tears ran down my face. The pain of losing my only brother tightened around my chest. But I knew I could not afford to fall apart. The battle against Cale was far from over. I needed to discover what secret this key would unlock. My brother's funeral was handled with great care at a peaceful cemetery. Cale never appeared. He vanished, completely taking his forged documents with him. Once everything had settled, I returned to the nursing home. I wanted to thank Esther Peeberly for the warning she had given me that night. I also wanted to ask whether she knew anything about the rusty key. I walked to the room next to Hollis's. The door stood wide open. Inside, the room was empty. Every trace of Esther's belongings had been removed. A nurse passing by looked at me with sympathy. She told me that Esther had died unexpectedly the night after Hollis passed away. My heart skipped a beat. Her death had come far too suddenly. The nurse glanced around before discreetly slipping a thick envelope into my hand. She told me that Esther had stayed awake all night before her death, writing it for me. I took the thick envelope from the nurse and hurried back to my car. The familiar scent of leather seats surrounded me. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope. Inside were several pages of handwritten notes in blue ink. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, but every line was filled with outrage. This was Esther's letter from beyond the grave. I took a deep breath and began reading in the absolute silence of the car. The very first lines felt like a hand squeezing my heart. Esther had not merely overheard what happened to Hollis. She had seen Cale and been reminded of the painful tragedy in her own past. The letter opened with a bitter confession. It wasn't my business, but I spoke up anyway. She went on to tell the story of her life. Back in 2009, she had been a happy mother who owned a successful chain of businesses. Her own son had deceived her with sweet promises and convincing words. He tricked her into signing away her assets. After stealing everything she owned, he abandoned her in that nursing home where she had spent the last 17 years of her life. And according to Esther, that son was none other than the accomplice behind Cale's dark dealings. I continued reading. Esther wrote that she had been watching Cale for months. He did not come to the nursing home to visit his father. He came searching for a secret metal box. Inside that box was a hard drive containing a complete list of victims and records of fraudulent schemes targeting elderly people. Cale had allegedly swindled dozens of lonely seniors across multiple states. The stolen money totaled millions of dollars. Hollis had discovered the truth, and he had hidden the box. That was why Cale had pressured him into signing documents while he was delirious. He wanted legal authority to search every corner of Hollis's property and destroy the evidence. As I read those words, I suddenly remembered the rusty key resting in my pocket. The key Hollis had given me before his death. It was the key to the metal box. Esther had even described where it was hidden. According to her letter, the box was concealed in a secret compartment behind the fireplace inside the lakeside cabin. Tears fell onto the pages. The poor woman had used the last of her strength to expose the truth. She wanted justice for Hollis. And for herself. I started the engine immediately. The car roared to life. I sped toward the cabin by the lake. The anger inside me had hardened into determination. I was going to tear away Cale's mask and drag his crimes into the light. But the moment I turned onto the road leading to the shoreline, I froze. A dark figure was already standing in front of the cabin. It was Cale. In his hand was a large gasoline can. Black smoke was beginning to rise from one of the living room windows. He had made his decision. If he could not steal the evidence, he would destroy it. And he was prepared to burn everything to the ground, to make sure no trace remained. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded across the gravel road with a screeching roar. I burst out of the vehicle like an arrow. The fury burning in my chest drowned out every trace of fear. Black smoke was billowing from the cabin windows. Cale spun around in shock, his face twisted with surprise. The gasoline can slipped from his hand and crashed to the ground. He had never expected me to arrive at that exact moment. He turned to run toward his luxury car. But I was faster. I lunged forward and grabbed him by the collar. Then I drove a punch into his face with every ounce of strength I had. He crashed to the ground. Blood poured from his nose, staining his spotless white shirt. He roared like a trapped animal. Shouting at me, he claimed it was already too late. The cabin would burn to ashes. The metal box would disappear forever. I looked directly into his eyes. Then I gave him a cold smile. Slowly I pulled the rusty key from my pocket. I told him the metal box was no longer inside the cabin. My brother had anticipated his desperation. Hollis had asked a trusted friend to deliver the box to the police station 2 days earlier. The key in my hand was simply the final piece needed to open it in front of investigators. The color instantly drained from Cale's face. His confidence shattered. His hands began to tremble. At that exact moment, police sirens echoed through the hills. Bryony had arrived with law enforcement shortly after I did. Fire trucks thundered onto the property as well, rushing to extinguish the fire before it could spread. Officers quickly restrained Cale and placed him in handcuffs. He collapsed to his knees. The polished image of a wealthy executive was gone. All that remained was a cowardly criminal caught in the act. Later, the metal box was opened at the investigative office. What investigators found inside the hard drive stunned everyone. It contained records of an elaborate fraud network. Cale and his associates had used forged documents to steal assets from more than 30 elderly victims living alone. The total amount taken exceeded $5 million. Esther's letter from beyond the grave became one of the strongest pieces of evidence exposing the scheme. Faced with overwhelming proof, Cale could no longer deny the truth. Justice finally caught up with him. The court sentenced him to 6 years in prison for fraud and the deliberate destruction of property. Every dollar of Hollis's $1.1 million estate was returned to Bryony. The punishment brought long overdue justice for my brother and for poor Esther. I wrapped my arms around Bryony in the courtroom. This time her tears were tears of relief rather than grief. The devil's mask had finally been torn away in the light of day. But just when I believed everything was over, the story took one final turn. A few days later, the police chief asked me to meet with him privately. Inside his office, he placed a brand new file on the desk. Then he delivered news that sent a chill through my entire body. Investigators had discovered a secret overseas bank account belonging to Cale. What troubled them was not the account itself. It was the source of the deposits. The account had been receiving enormous transfers of money for years, and those transfers came from an unidentified individual within our own family. The real mastermind behind everything had not been arrested. The person pulling the strings was still out there, still free, still hiding in plain sight. The brown file sat motionless on the police chief's desk. I stared at the name connected to the secret transfers. A heavy weight settled over my heart. It turned out that human greed was a bottomless pit. It could spread. It could consume an entire family. But I made a decision. I would not sink deeper into that cycle of hatred. I left all the evidence in the hands of the law. My responsibility now was to care for the people who were still living. Bryony and I decided to use part of Hollis's insurance money to establish a legal assistance fund for senior citizens. We named it the Esther Peberly Fund. I wanted to make sure that elderly people living alone would always have someone to protect them. Esther's painful story would never be forgotten. The lakeside cabin was repaired after the fire. The black smoke was gone. In its place came the gentle fragrance of real lavender growing around the porch. As I watched Bryony breathe life back into her father's home, I realized something important. The greatest lesson I learned from that 11-hour journey was to trust my instincts. Never allow polished appearances or sweet words to cloud your judgment. In a world filled with manipulation, kindness sometimes needs to be accompanied by awareness and a clear mind. Family is sacred, but sometimes the people who share your blood are the very ones willing to stab you in the back. The price of speaking the truth may be a moment of discomfort. The price of remaining silent may be someone else's entire life. Do not stay silent. Thank you for spending this time with Dad's real-life revenge. Don't forget to share your own story in the comments and subscribe so you won't miss future lessons learned the hard way. I'll see you in the next video. I looked out across the calm lake, reflecting the final rays of the setting sun. I remembered my brother's final squeeze of my hand. I remembered Esther's whisper at 2 o'clock in the morning. Those words still haunt me to this day, and I want to leave them with you. Sometimes, the person who saves a family isn't the strongest one. It's the one who refuses to look away when something feels wrong. Dad, we've made our decision. We're selling the house at Kerr Lake. You have until the end of the month to move out. Every single word hit my ears. Clear, cruel. I felt my chest tighten like a steel beam collapsing under too much pressure. This house was not just wood and walls. It was my blood, my sweat, my entire life. It carried the soul of Renee, my late wife. And now the son I sacrificed everything to raise was ordering me out like I was some old piece of furniture. It was a windy May morning at Kerr Lake. I was sitting by the dock watching the waves roll softly against the wooden posts. My phone vibrated on the table. Brad, my oldest son. 8:14 in the morning. I answered the call. Before I could even say hello, his cold, arrogant voice cut through the line. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not care what I was doing. He went straight to business like a man clearing out unwanted inventory. I stayed silent. My hand tightened around the armrest of the chair. Rage climbed into my throat like fire. I am a structural engineer. I spent my entire life calculating pressure, stress points, and structural failure, but I failed to calculate the breaking point in my own son's character. Brad kept talking in that superior tone. He said the real estate market was hot. He said I was too old to live alone in such a large house. He said he had already found a buyer. He had even signed a brokerage agreement without asking for my permission. Not once. He treated me like a confused old man who would simply obey. Betrayal always tastes bitter, but betrayal from your own blood tastes like destruction. He wanted to sell this house for a few $100,000 to fund the lifestyle of his new wife. They thought I had outlived my usefulness. They thought I was powerless. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Settle in because this story is going to take you a long way. Hit the like button and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Brad ended the call with a fake little reminder as if he were doing me a favor. I placed the phone down on the table and stared across the lake. Suddenly the anger disappeared. In its place came something far more dangerous. Calm. A cold smile slowly spread across my face. A house can only stand if the foundation is strong. Brad and Tim wanted to tear mine apart. What they did not know was this: an engineer always keeps a backup blueprint. After the long beep from Brad's call finally faded away, the world around me became strangely silent. I sat motionless in the old armchair. My eyes drifted down to the cedar floorboards beneath my feet. Time had faded their color, but they were still solid and unshaken. I am a structural engineer. My entire life has revolved around blueprints, concrete, and load-bearing structures. I understand the value of a strong foundation better than most people. And this house at Kerr Lake was the greatest structure I ever built. I started building it in the spring of 1993. Back then, Renee and I had only been married a few years. We did not have much money, but we had enormous dreams. I still remember the feeling of pouring the first concrete foundation with my own hands. Every brick carried my sweat and my wife's smile. Renee stood right there on the porch corner, holding a glass of lemonade, her eyes glowing with excitement as our dream slowly rose from the ground. Together, we picked every wooden panel and every screw. I designed this house to survive the harshest Wisconsin winters. For more than 30 years, its structure had never trembled before a single storm. This was the house where Brad and Tim took their first steps. This was the house that held their childhood laughter. And this was the house that carried the final warmth of Renee before illness took her away from me. Every corner of this place carried her spirit. To me, this house was part of my soul. It was legacy. It was love. It was the final promise connecting me to my late wife. But to my sons, it was nothing more than property converted into cash. Brad and Tim looked at these walls and saw numbers. They either forgot or chose to forget that this very house had raised them into men. Selling it was like taking a hammer and smashing apart the memory of their own mother piece by piece. The pain inside me slowly turned into heartbreak. I lifted my eyes toward the family photo hanging in the living room. Renee was smiling in the picture, holding our two young boys in her arms. How had those innocent little boys become this cold and greedy? The warmth of memory vanished beneath the weight of reality. My sons had changed. Somewhere along the way, the rust of greed had begun eating through this family, and I had been too blind to see it. But Brad and Tim underestimated their engineer father. They thought I would cry, beg, or quietly pack my belongings and leave in humiliation. They believed they controlled the entire game after deciding the fate of my property without permission. What they failed to understand was this greed makes people blind, and blind people always miss the most important structural flaw. This battle had only just begun, and I had already found the fatal crack in their cruel little plan. The betrayal born from greed does not arrive like an explosion. It spreads like rust, quietly eating away at the load-bearing structure of a house. Slowly, patiently, corroding everything from the inside out. And by the time you finally notice it, the entire structure has already collapsed. As I sat there, I realized with bitter clarity that my family had been destroyed by that same silent corrosion. The one behind it all was Brad. My oldest son used to be a good kid. But everything changed after he married his new wife. She had an endless appetite for luxury. Designer clothes, expensive vacations, flashy parties meant to impress strangers who did not care about them. Brad's salary could never keep up with the bottomless greed she carried inside her. Financial pressure slowly transformed him into an arrogant and selfish man. He stopped seeing my home as family. He started seeing it as a lifeboat for his dying bank account. And then there was Tim, my younger son. He was not the mastermind, but he was something worse in his own way. A coward. Tim had always been afraid of his older brother. He had no backbone, no conviction of his own. Deep down, he knew forcing their father out of his home was wrong. He knew selling the house behind my back was unforgivable. But he nodded anyway. His weakness disgusted me almost more than Brad's cruelty. I spent my entire life teaching my sons about honor, gratitude, and responsibility. And in the end, what did I get in return? Two grown men circling their own father like vultures, waiting to strip away the last roof over his head. For the first time, I began to feel uneasy. Not for myself, for what they might do next. Because greed never stops once it awakens. They had already hired a realtor without permission. They had already given me a deadline to leave my own home, which meant they had likely prepared something far more calculated behind the scenes. I looked out the window toward Kerr Lake. The sky had darkened. A real storm was coming. But my sons had made one critical mistake. In construction, even the smallest crack in a blueprint can bring down an entire skyscraper. Brad and Tim were amateurs trying to outplay a veteran engineer. They thought I was old, weak, confused. They believed I knew nothing about the schemes unfolding behind my back. What they did not realize was this. Overconfidence is the deadliest structural flaw of all. And that flaw was about to lead them straight into a trap they would never see coming. The next phone call on Sunday would expose every ugly truth hiding beneath their smiling faces. Just as I predicted, the next call came on Sunday. That day, rain poured endlessly from the sky. Heavy drops slammed against the windows as if they were trying to shatter the last traces of peace left inside the house. Then my phone rang. This time, it was a group call from both Brad and Tim. I turned on speakerphone. Brad's voice came first, carrying the same impatient, arrogant tone as always. But this time, I could also hear Tim's weak, guilty muttering in the background. Brad wasted no time. He announced that they had officially signed a contract with a real estate agent named Mark Benson. According to him, the house at Kerr Lake had been appraised at $390,000, a pathetic number, an insult to a solidly built home sitting on prime lakefront property. But my sons were desperate for money. They were willing to sell their mother's memories and throw their father out onto the street as long as cash arrived quickly enough. I asked them only one question, my voice perfectly calm. You signed a contract without asking me first. Brad laughed softly through the phone. He said it did not matter. He said Mark Benson was a professional and had already found a buyer willing to pay within the month. That was when Tim finally spoke. He told me I should cooperate. He said moving into a small apartment downtown would be better for someone my age. They worked together surprisingly well. One pushed, the other pretended to comfort. Together, they were trying to corner me. Anyone listening to this would feel furious. My own sons were making decisions about the life of the man who had spent decades feeding them, protecting them, and building their future with his bare hands. Inside me, the pressure reached its breaking point. The pride of a father was being trampled. The dignity of an engineer was being mocked. They truly believed I was nothing more than a harmless obstacle standing in their way. Then Brad crossed the final line. In a cold voice, he said that if I refused to move out willingly, they would hire people to pack my belongings for me. The cruelty of those words went beyond anything I had imagined possible. I took a deep breath to hold back the rage boiling inside my chest. I did not yell. I did not cry. And suddenly the silence on my end made them hesitate. They mistook my silence for surrender. They thought the old man was finally broken. Brad ended the call after reminding me about the signing appointment scheduled for the following week. Then, the line went dead. I sat alone in the darkness of the room while the rain continued crashing outside. They thought they had won. They thought they had trapped me with nowhere left to run. But they were wrong. The battle had only begun. The moment the call ended, I stood up and walked toward my office. It was finally time to open the locked security drawer, because hidden inside that drawer was a weapon powerful enough to destroy their entire plan. I walked into my office in complete silence. Outside, the rain continued hammering against the windows, but inside me, the storm had settled. I was no longer angry. A good engineer never lets emotion take control when a structure is on the verge of collapse. I stepped toward the old oak desk. Beneath the right corner was a drawer that always remained locked. I called it the serious drawer. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver key. The sharp click of the lock echoed through the empty room. Then I opened the drawer and removed a thick blue folder. It had been sitting there untouched since 2016. Inside were the documents for my second property, a place called Garrison Lake Lodge. The lodge sat deep inside an isolated pine forest somewhere in Wisconsin. No one in my family knew it existed. Not Brad. Not Tim. No one. Back in 2016, after completing a massive construction project, I used my personal savings to quietly purchase the land. Over the years, I secretly transformed it into one of the most luxurious private retreats in the region. I had planned to reveal it as a surprise inheritance for my sons after my death. It was the only legal inheritance they had left. A strange mixture of curiosity and disappointment rose inside me as I flipped through the pages. Photographs of the lodge appeared one after another. The massive stone fireplace, the handcrafted cedar interior, the private lake hidden behind walls of towering pine trees. Its value had skyrocketed over the years. Meanwhile, my sons were desperately clawing over the $390,000 from selling the old Kerr Lake house. They had no idea that their blind greed was about to cost them something worth many times more. I slowly ran my hand across the folder. Their betrayal had finally helped me make a clear decision. My backup blueprint was ready, and now it was time to activate it. I carefully placed the documents into a black leather briefcase. They wanted to play a cruel game with me. Fine. I would play along. I would stay silent and let them keep performing their little victory dance all the way to the closing table. Tomorrow I would meet with my lawyer, and together we would prepare the perfect trap. The next morning I drove downtown to the office of attorney Raymond Castillo. The rain had stopped, but puddles still covered the streets, reflecting the dull gray sky above. A strange mixture of anticipation and tension kept my mind razor sharp. On the passenger seat beside me rested the black leather briefcase containing the Garrison Lake Lodge documents and the legal paperwork for the Kerr Lake house. By then, my home at Kerr Lake had officially been listed online for $390,000. When I saw the listing price, I almost laughed. My sons were fools. They believed they were walking away with a fortune. They had no idea they were throwing away a treasure for pennies just to satisfy temporary greed. And somehow, that insult only strengthened my resolve. I entered Raymond's office a few minutes later. Raymond Castillo had been my lawyer and close friend for years. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a look filled with concern. He had already reviewed the documents I sent him earlier. I sat down calmly and explained my plan. I told him I would not resist. I did not want shouting matches or ugly confrontations with Brad and Tim. Instead, I wanted him to prepare every legal document necessary for the sale. But everything had to happen exactly according to my script. Raymond stared at me in disbelief. He asked if I was truly willing to let my sons go this far. I looked him directly in the eyes and answered in a cold, steady voice. Let them finish their performance. A good engineer never puts out a fire the moment it starts. I'm going to let the fire of their greed grow as large as possible right there at the closing table, and at the exact moment they believe victory is finally theirs, I'll remove the one support beam holding everything together. That was the beginning of my silent game. For the entire following week, I completely cut off contact with both of my sons. I ignored every call, every message, every voicemail. My silence convinced Brad and Tim that I had finally broken down and accepted my fate. A few days later, they sent me the details for the closing appointment at the Lakeland office. Their message was short and cold. Bring your identification. Be there on time. I read the text message slowly and smiled to myself. The blueprint was complete. Every piece was now in position. My silence had become the most dangerous weapon of all. Brad and Tim were confidently marching toward the Lakeland office, without realizing that the room waiting for them was no longer a closing office. It was a legal execution chamber built specifically for them, and in the next chapter, the shock waiting inside that room would shatter everything they thought they controlled. On the morning of the closing, I arrived at the Lakeland office 15 minutes early. The air inside felt heavy, thick with the smell of expensive perfume and polished leather. Tension pressed against my chest like concrete settling under massive weight. I sat silently in the corner of the room, one hand gripping the black leather briefcase beside me. Exactly at 9 o'clock, Brad walked in. Confidence radiated from every step he took. He wore an expensive tailored jacket and polished leather shoes that gleamed beneath the office lights. His face carried the bright excitement of a man convinced he was about to strike gold. He glanced at me with fake sympathy before casually taking the seat across from me. Brad kept scrolling through his phone, smirking to himself. I knew exactly what he was doing. Counting money that did not belong to him yet. A few moments later, Tim entered the room. Unlike his brother, he avoided looking at me altogether. His head stayed lowered, guilt written all over his face. Then the buyers arrived. Mr. and Mrs. Marsh entered alongside the realtor, Mark Benson. They carried thick folders filled with paperwork. The closing table was finally complete. Benson quickly spread the contracts across the table and pushed them toward Brad with eager hands. Brad grabbed the pen immediately. Without hesitation, he scribbled his signature across the seller's section, as though the house already belonged to him. Then he turned toward me with that same arrogant tone. Dad, your turn. Sign it so we can finish this quickly. Every eye in the room shifted toward me. The contrast between us could not have been clearer. Brad sat there, polished, impatient, intoxicated by greed. Meanwhile, I remained perfectly still, cold, solid, like reinforced concrete. I stared silently at the papers in front of me. This was the moment my son's cruelty reached its peak. They truly believed I would sign away my own home and quietly accept exile from the house I built with my bare hands. Slowly, I placed the leather briefcase on the table. The silence in the room suddenly changed. Brad's smile stiffened. For the first time all morning, uncertainty flickered across his face. He tapped his fingers impatiently against the table. What are you waiting for, Dad? People are waiting. I still said nothing. I simply looked directly into his eyes. It was the cold stare of an engineer who had finally located the fatal fracture inside a collapsing structure. Then I reached into my jacket pocket, but not for a pen. If you've made it this far into the story, then it probably stirred something inside you. Help us out with one quick thing. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you're still here. A lot of people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. I pulled out my phone. The screen displayed an incoming call from attorney Raymond Castillo. Without breaking eye contact with Brad, I placed the phone directly in the center of the closing table and turned on speakerphone. Then Raymond's firm voice filled the room, and in a single moment the entire atmosphere changed. Attorney Raymond Castillo's voice came through the speakerphone, sharp and unwavering. Good morning, everyone at the Lakeland office. This is attorney Raymond Castillo, legal representative for Mr. Jude Logan. I have an urgent announcement. The sale of the Kerr Lake property must stop immediately. This contract has absolutely no legal validity. The room fell into dead silence. Brad's arrogant smile vanished instantly. He shot up from his chair, his face burning red with rage. "What are you talking about?" he shouted into the phone. "I'm his son. My brother and I have full authority over this property." Across the table, realtor Mark Benson suddenly began sweating as he frantically flipped through the paperwork. But Raymond's voice remained calm, cold, precise, like a blade sliding through steel. "You are mistaken, Brad. You and Tim are listed as heirs under your late mother's estate. However, you failed to read the attached conditions carefully. According to Renee Logan's will, the Kerr Lake house remains under the sole ownership authority of Mr. Jude Logan until the day of his death. Any sale, transfer, or financial agreement requires his direct written consent and signature. Your attempt to sign documents and hire a realtor without your father's authorization is a direct legal violation. This transaction is now officially frozen." And just like that, the truth detonated in the middle of the room. The engineer's strike had landed perfectly. A deep sense of satisfaction rose inside my chest as I watched my son's entire scheme collapse beneath them. Justice had finally arrived. A good engineer always leaves behind a backup design. Brad and Tim thought they could outsmart a man who spent his entire life calculating structural weaknesses and failure points. They were wrong, completely wrong. The buyers, Mr. and Mrs. Marsh, immediately stood from the table in outrage. They felt deceived and manipulated. Within seconds, they gathered their paperwork and announced they were canceling the deal entirely. Before leaving, they threatened legal action against Mark Benson's brokerage company. Benson looked like all the blood had drained from his body. He turned toward Brad with pure hatred burning in his eyes. And then came the collapse. Brad dropped back into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The polished confidence from earlier was gone. Now there was only panic. Pure panic. He looked up at me with trembling eyes. "Dad, why would you do this to us? We really need this money." Beside him, Tim had started crying, quietly begging for forgiveness under his breath. I slowly stood from my chair and buttoned my jacket calmly. Then I looked at my sons. But I no longer saw my children. I saw two greedy men completely blinded by their own hunger. I looked directly at Brad and spoke only once. "You were willing to sell your mother's memory for $390,000. Greed has made both of you blind." Then, I picked up the black leather briefcase from the table. The battle at the Lakeland office was over, and my sons had suffered a humiliating defeat. But I was not finished yet. That was only the first strike, only the first crack destroying the illusion they had built around themselves. Because I still had one final blow waiting for them, one number so massive, it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. I did not rush to leave the Lakeland office. Instead, I stood there quietly, looking down at my two broken sons sitting across the table. Panic and despair had swallowed them whole. But for me, the performance was not over yet. Not even close. They still needed to learn the final lesson about the true value of what they had betrayed. Slowly, I placed the black leather briefcase back onto the table. The sharp click of the lock opening echoed through the room once again, drawing Brad's trembling eyes toward me. For a brief second, hope flickered across his face. He thought I was about to change my mind. He thought mercy was coming. But he was wrong. I pulled out the thick blue folder containing the documents for Garrison Lake Lodge. The folder from my serious drawer. Then I tossed it directly in front of him. "Look at this." My voice remained calm, but every word carried the weight of concrete collapsing onto steel. Brad's hands shook as he opened the file page by page. His eyes widened the moment he saw photographs of the luxury lodge hidden deep inside the Wisconsin pine forest. Then his breathing stopped completely when he reached the final valuation page. $1.1 million. Slowly, I began to speak. Every sentence cut through the room like a sharpened blade. "This is Garrison Lake Lodge. It is worth nearly 3 times more than the Kerr Lake house you were so desperate to sell. I secretly bought and built it back in 2016. My original plan was to leave it to both of you as your inheritance after I was gone. It was supposed to belong to my sons." The room felt like it had just been hit by an explosion. Brad and Tim froze completely. The contrast between the miserable $390,000 they had been fighting over and the $1.1 million they had just lost forever was too much for them to process. Brad's face turned pale as death. His lips trembled uncontrollably. Beside him, Tim broke down, sobbing, pounding his forehead against the table in unbearable regret. For a quick profit, they had destroyed the very foundation of their own future. Then I delivered the final blow, the knockout strike. I looked directly into their shattered faces and spoke one final truth. But that was yesterday's plan. The moment you called me on Sunday, I met with attorney Raymond Castillo. I signed every document transferring full ownership of Garrison Lake Lodge to a non-profit organization that supports underprivileged children. You will not receive a single dollar from my estate. The silence afterward was unbearable. Then I gave them the final sentence they would carry for the rest of their lives. Your greed erased you from the blueprint of my future. I picked up my briefcase and turned toward the door without hesitation. Behind me came the sound of choking sobs and the complete collapse of two men who had just lost everything. But even then, the worst consequence for Brad had not arrived yet, and the true peace waiting for the old engineer still lay ahead. In the days following that disastrous closing meeting, my sons' lives spiraled into a collapse they could no longer stop. Brad soon found himself drowning in serious legal trouble. Mr. and Mrs. Marsh officially filed a lawsuit against him for fraud and the illegal attempt to sell property that was never his to control. And the woman he sacrificed everything for, the wife who loved luxury designer labels and expensive appearances, she wasted no time. The moment she realized Brad was buried in debt, she filed for divorce and walked away with what little money he had left. Tim suffered differently. He drowned in guilt. Day after day, he sent messages begging for forgiveness. Long apologies, broken promises, desperate pleas. But it was too late. Once the foundation of trust collapses, it can never truly be rebuilt. As for me, I moved into Garrison Lake Lodge. The peace there felt almost unreal. That evening, I sat on the wooden porch of the lodge, hidden deep within the Wisconsin pine forest. A glass of red wine rested in my hand while the sunset slowly melted across the still surface of the lake. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Beside me sat a framed photograph of Renee. I smiled softly at her picture and realized something important. I had protected the honor of this family. My story became proof of one simple truth about life. Greed is like defective material in construction. It may help you build beautiful illusions for a little while, but eventually it will bring the entire structure crashing down. Respect, family, the love between parent and child. Those things can never be purchased with money. And the price of greed and betrayal will always be far greater than anyone imagines. If you fail to value the foundation of your family one day, you will pay for it with your future. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what lesson you took away from it. I'll see you again in the next story. I lifted my glass and took one final sip of wine while the cool lake breeze drifted through the pine trees around me. The old engineer had finally completed the last blueprint of his life. A blueprint with no room left for betrayal, only peace, only justice. I was 63 years old, living alone, and I believed my son was the only person I could trust. But last week I lied to him about being alone. That lie uncovered a horrifying crime planned against me. I was lucky to survive long enough to tell you this story. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Please subscribe and comment number 1 so we can begin this story. Before we start, I want to remind you of one thing. This is a true story. If you stay until the end, you will understand why I say that. It started every Sunday morning at exactly 7 o'clock. The phone on the wooden table would vibrate right on time. The default ringtone echoed through the empty house. My son, a successful businessman, always called with perfect precision. He asked about the weather. He asked about the hydrangeas blooming outside the house. And always the final question was about the pills. Dad, did you take the white pill yet? Did anyone come by to visit you today? I used to think it was the purest form of devotion from a caring son. I felt proud of how attentive he was. I took the pills exactly the way he instructed me to, without the slightest doubt. This house was too large for an old widower. His voice over the phone was the only thread connecting me to the outside world. But that concern slowly began to carry a different taste. It no longer sounded like love. It sounded like surveillance, like a prison guard checking whether his inmate was still locked inside the cell. The 7 o'clock phone call became an invisible pressure, crushing down on me. I stared at the cup of coffee, growing cold on the table. The steam had vanished. The silence inside the house began squeezing my chest tighter every day. I glanced toward the plastic pill organizer divided neatly by days of the week. The pills sat there in silence, waiting for me. Or perhaps waiting for the end of me. Love and harm can wear the exact same clothes for a very long time before you finally see through the fabric. That Sunday morning, something small happened that changed everything. Frank, my best friend from college, showed up unexpectedly at my door. He carried a paper bag filled with pastries, and the same bright smile I remembered from 40 years ago. It had been 18 months since this house last heard another person's laughter besides mine. We sat together in the living room talking about old memories, old road trips, old mistakes, old dreams that now sounded like stories from another lifetime. The clock slowly crept towards 7 o'clock. My heart suddenly skipped a beat. Then the familiar ringtone shattered the warm silence of the room. Out of habit, I answered immediately. My son's calm voice came through the speaker. He asked about my health, like always. Asked whether my knees still hurt from the cold weather. Asked whether the hydrangeas outside were blooming again. Then suddenly he asked the question, "Dad, is anyone there with you today?" I looked at Frank. He smiled casually and motioned for me to keep talking. But in that exact moment, an icy sensation crawled down my spine. The instinct of a man who had lived through more than 6 decades whispered something terrifying into my ear. Hide the truth. I took a slow breath. Then I answered quietly, "No, I'm alone today." It was the first time in 18 months that I had lied to my son. A harmless little lie. Or so I thought. Because the reaction on the other end of the call froze the blood in my veins. There was no immediate response, only silence. A long silence. Not peaceful silence, heavy silence, the kind of silence that feels alive. I could hear his faint breathing through the phone. He was thinking, processing the information. And then it came. A strange relief entered his voice, a disturbing softness, like tension had suddenly drained out of his body. "Oh, that's good then. Make sure you get some rest, Dad." That single pause before he answered changed everything inside me forever. His relief was not the relief of a loving son knowing his father was safe. It was the relief of a predator realizing the prey was finally alone inside the trap. My hand was still trembling after I ended the call. Frank looked at me with concern and asked whether I was all right. I forced out a weak smile to calm him down. But deep inside me something had cracked wide open. I turned toward the window. Outside, the hydrangeas drooped under the pale morning sunlight. Why was my son relieved to know I was alone? What exactly was he hiding from me? The answer was waiting inside the pillbox the very next morning. And Frank was the one who accidentally saw it first. Monday morning, Frank woke up early and insisted on making breakfast for both of us himself. I sat quietly at the dining table, watching my old friend moving slowly around the kitchen. The smell of freshly ground coffee spread through the house, bringing a false sense of peace into the room. Frank opened the medicine cabinet to grab my weekly pill organizer. By routine, the Saturday compartment should have been completely empty. I had taken those pills 2 days earlier. But suddenly Frank froze. He walked toward me, holding the plastic container in his hand, his forehead wrinkled with confusion. "John, what's this little white pill? Why did you leave it in here?" I looked down at the transparent compartment. A small, round white pill rested silently at the bottom. My chest tightened instantly. My mind began spinning. I had always been extremely careful about my health. I never forgot my medication, especially my blood pressure prescription. Never. I picked up the pill slowly. Its surface was smooth. No letters, no markings. Then realization hit me like ice water. It looked nothing like the capsules my doctor prescribed. Not even close. None of my medications were white. A horrifying suspicion began crawling through my mind. Who put this pill inside my box? This house was locked down tightly. The smart security system only allowed 2 people access to the front door code. Me and my son. He was the only person who entered my house every Friday afternoon to clean the place and prepare my pills for the following week. The equation was painfully simple, and the answer was so devastating it nearly stopped my breathing. My son had switched my medication. But how long had he been doing it, and why? I slipped the pill quietly into my shirt pocket, forcing myself to stay calm so Frank would not panic. But beneath the table my hand had already curled into a tight fist. I stared at the coffee slowly growing cold beside me. The truth was opening in front of me like a bottomless black hole. That pill was not medication. It was evidence. Evidence of a slow and calculated murder. My only son, the person I loved more than my own life, had been poisoning me in silence. And suddenly the terrifying dizziness from the past few months came rushing back into my memory. The nights where my vision blurred, the moments where my legs collapsed beneath me, the terrifying feeling that my heart might simply stop beating before sunrise. Back then I thought old age was finally catching up with me. Now I realized something far worse. Someone had been helping death reach me faster. The white pill rested deep inside my pocket like a piece of frozen ice, and with it came memories I had desperately tried to ignore. For the past 3 months my body had been screaming for help. The dizzy spells came almost every afternoon. Without warning, the floor would tilt beneath my feet. My thoughts drifted constantly inside a thick fog. I lost focus, lost direction, lost pieces of myself little by little. I told myself it was old age. I believed my mind was simply beginning to fade. But the most terrifying part was remembering the moments when my son witnessed those collapses. He would see me stumbling beside the couch, gripping the furniture just to stay standing, his face always filled with panic and concern. "Dad, did you forget your medication again?" His voice sounded so caring. He rushed over to support my weight, guided me gently back to bed, poured me a glass of warm water with his own hands. At the time, I felt deeply moved by his devotion. Now, replaying those memories made my skin crawl, because I finally understood the truth. He saw everything. He watched my body grow weaker day after day from the pills he himself had secretly replaced, and he kept doing it anyway. Some nights I woke up gasping because the room felt unbearably suffocating. The smart climate system inside the house constantly changed temperatures at strange hours. Whenever I questioned it, my son always smiled softly. "I adjusted it for your health, Dad. The weather has been dangerous lately." That kindness now revealed its true face. It was not care. It was control. He wanted me weak. He wanted me exhausted. He wanted me to believe I could no longer take care of myself. I sat alone in the darkness of the living room, staring through the window at the hydrangeas outside slowly wilting from lack of water. I no longer had the strength to care for them. Exactly the future my beloved son seemed to be creating for me. But one mysterious pill was not enough. I needed undeniable proof. I needed to witness what he was doing with my own eyes. That night I made the most dangerous decision of my life. I secretly installed a tiny hidden camera inside the bathroom, directly above the medicine cabinet. Then I connected the feed to my old laptop and waited patiently for Friday to arrive. I had no idea what I was about to discover. But the footage recorded that night completely shattered the heart of a father forever. Friday afternoon arrived exactly as expected. My son walked through the front door carrying a bag of fresh fruit in one hand. He smiled casually, talked normally, acted exactly the way he always did. He cleaned the living room for a while before walking into the bathroom to prepare my medication for the following week. I sat silently in the bedroom nearby, my fingers tightly locked together. The laptop resting on my knees displayed the live feed from the hidden camera. Every instinct inside me whispered the same terrifying truth. This was the moment everything would be exposed. On the small screen, I watched him standing in front of the medicine cabinet. He had no idea a hidden lens was staring at him from the darkness. He opened my weekly pill organizer. Then slowly he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic bottle with no label. My heart stopped. He poured several small white pills into his palm. The same hands I once held while teaching him how to walk were now carefully removing my yellow prescription capsules one by one and replacing them with the white pills. His movements were calm, precise, practiced. He never trembled. Every motion looked disturbingly familiar, like someone repeating a routine they had performed many times before. Occasionally he paused to listen for sounds coming from my bedroom. When he was certain I was not approaching, he continued. The face of my beloved son stared back at me through the screen, but I no longer recognized him. That was not the caring child I raised. That was a cold-blooded predator wearing the face of an angel. Pain crushed my chest so violently I could barely breathe. I covered my mouth with both hands to stop myself from sobbing out loud. Hot tears rolled down my face and splashed onto the laptop keyboard. That was my son, the little boy I once carried in my arms, the child I spent my entire life protecting. And now he was personally guiding his own father toward death. If you've made it this far into the story, then you already know this nightmare is only getting darker. Please take one quick second to like, subscribe, and comment number 2 so I know you're still here with me. Most people watch without doing it, but it truly helps our channel more than you realize. And trust me, what happens next is something you will never see coming. The moment he stepped out of the bathroom, I slammed the laptop shut. I had to use every ounce of strength left inside me to keep my voice steady when he said goodbye before leaving. Then the front door closed. The sound echoed through the house like a coffin lid being sealed shut. I slowly collapsed onto the floor. Alone. Broken. The truth was finally undeniable, but the pain was almost too much to survive. I could not stay silent anymore. If I did nothing, I would die. The next morning I took one of the white pills and went directly to my doctor and the police. What they discovered inside my blood test results was not just poison. It revealed a horrifying secret about my son's real motive. I walked into the police station with a coldness that frightened even me. The weak old man I had been no longer existed after the moment I closed that laptop the night before. On the detective's desk, I placed the small plastic bag containing the white pills alongside the footage from the hidden camera. 2 days later, the blood test results arrived from the central hospital. The older doctor looked at me with deep pity in his eyes. Then he slowly shook his head. He pointed toward the numbers on the medical report. My potassium levels had been pushed down to a dangerously critical point. The white pills were powerful diuretics. For an elderly man with a heart condition like mine, taking them continuously for several months would almost certainly trigger either a stroke or sudden heart failure. A perfect natural death. Clean. Silent. No obvious criminal evidence left behind. I stared at the report in silence while my hands slowly turned numb. My own son had not tried to kill me in anger. He had planned it patiently, scientifically. The financial investigation that followed exposed the rest of the nightmare. My son was drowning in debt. His cryptocurrency investments had collapsed. His real estate projects were frozen. The amount he owed was staggering. He needed money. Fast. A lot of money. Police investigators later found internet searches on his computer about the details of my life insurance policy. A $2 million policy I had signed 10 years earlier. With only one beneficiary. Him. That was the moment I understood the horrifying truth. My life had been reduced to a financial solution. Nothing more. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before walking back into my house that evening. Through the front window, I could see the cup of coffee still sitting untouched on the table. Cold. Lifeless. Everything around me suddenly felt disgusting. The police proposed a plan to catch him the following Friday inside my own home. I had to pretend I knew nothing. I had to sit across from my son one final time and act like a helpless father who still trusted him completely. But how do you hug the person trying to murder you? How do you look into your child's eyes and still say the words, "I love you"? The answer waited inside the suffocating confrontation that was about to destroy what remained of our family. Forever. The final Friday finally arrived. 2 plainclothes police officers were already hidden inside the back room of my house. I sat quietly in my armchair, forcing my breathing to remain steady. Then I heard the soft click of the front door unlocking. My son walked inside. The same warm smile rested on his face. The same gentle eyes. The same voice that used to make me feel safe. He walked over to me, placed a bag of groceries on the table, then leaned down beside my chair. His face overflowed with carefully crafted concern. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" Still getting dizzy, I looked directly into the eyes of the child I had spent my entire life raising. My chest tightened so hard it almost crushed the air out of me. But somehow I forced myself to smile. I told him I still felt weak, but seeing him always made me feel better. He nodded with quiet satisfaction. Then he stood up and walked toward the bathroom to perform the same ritual he had repeated every Friday for months. I watched his back disappear down the hallway. Every movement he made was now streaming live to the officers waiting in the next room. A few minutes later, he returned to the living room. In his hands were a glass of warm water and my prepared medication tray. He sat beside me carefully and held the water toward my trembling hands. "Your face looks worse lately, Dad." I think you need a stronger dose of supplements. Go ahead and take them. You'll feel better soon." Every instinct inside my body screamed at me to throw the pills across the room. But I had to finish the performance. I reached for the glass. My fingers brushed against his hand. Ice cold. Then suddenly, before the police revealed themselves, my son leaned forward and wrapped his arms tightly around me. He pressed his mouth close to my ear and whispered softly, "I love you so much, Dad. I want you to stay with me for a very long time." My heart shattered completely, because I knew that beneath those loving words lived a calculated murder plan driven by greed and desperation. And yet in that unbearable moment I still lifted my hand and gently patted his back. I whispered back, "I love you too." And the worst part was that I truly meant it. That was the real tragedy. Not the poison, not the betrayal, but the fact that even after discovering everything, a father's love inside me had refused to die. Then the illusion exploded apart. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. The officers burst into the living room and pinned my son to the ground instantly. The glass shattered. The pills scattered across the floor. My son screamed in shock as the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. But then something happened that froze every person in that room. Because instead of denying the crime, he started laughing. A cold, empty laugh. And the horrifying truth that came out of his mouth next left both me and the police completely speechless. When the handcuffs locked around his wrists, my son did not panic. He did not cry. He did not beg for forgiveness. He simply stood there staring at the two officers with a hollow expression so empty it felt inhuman. Then slowly he turned toward me. A pale smile appeared on his face. And in an eerily calm voice he said, "See, Dad, I told you the world out there is dangerous. I'm the only one who can truly protect you." The room went completely silent. Even the officers froze for a moment. Those words felt far more terrifying than the poison itself. Over the following days, the investigation uncovered something far darker than financial desperation. Police did not only find the mountain of debt, they also discovered hidden psychiatric records my son had kept secret for years. After extensive evaluations, the medical specialists reached a conclusion that left me completely shattered. My son suffered from severe paranoid anxiety disorder. The crushing pressure of financial collapse had slowly broken his mind apart. He became obsessed with control, especially control over me. Yes, the life insurance money was part of the motive, but the most horrifying truth was this. In his twisted mind, he genuinely believed he was protecting me. He believed the outside world was filled with people waiting to harm our family. And according to the broken logic inside his head, the only way to keep me safe forever was to make me weak, dependent, unable to leave him. If I could no longer walk properly, if my memory faded, if I depended entirely on him for survival, then I would always remain under his control. Safe. That was the word he used repeatedly during questioning. Safe. It was not ordinary greed. It was love distorted into something sick and unrecognizable. My son wanted to become the sole savior of my life, even if it meant slowly killing me in the process. That truth hurt far more than simple betrayal ever could. I sat inside the observation room, staring through the one-way glass at my only child. He was murmuring softly to himself. His fingers moved unconsciously through the air, repeating the motion of sorting pills into imaginary compartments. At that moment, I no longer knew what justice even meant. What punishment fits a man who is both a calculated criminal and a deeply broken patient? Prison, a psychiatric institution, mercy, condemnation. The answer would come in a way neither my son nor I could have ever imagined. Instead of a loud courtroom trial and a long prison sentence, justice arrived in a very different form. Based on the psychiatric evaluations and forensic reports, the court ruled that my son would be committed to a mandatory psychiatric treatment facility. Not prison, a place with endless white walls and barred windows. A place where he would finally be forced to face the paranoid monster slowly consuming his mind. The day they transferred him away, I stood at a distance watching the ambulance disappear beyond the line of trees. I did not cry anymore. The pain had burned itself so deeply into me that it transformed into something colder, something empty. I returned home alone. The same house that once felt like an invisible prison suddenly seemed enormous and strangely quiet. The very first thing I did was change every security code connected to the smart home system. Then I picked up the remote control myself and adjusted the living room temperature to 26 degrees. The temperature I personally loved, not the suffocating setting my son used to force on me while pretending it was for my own health. I walked into the bathroom and gathered every unidentified pill bottle I could find. Then, I dumped them straight into the trash. The sound of the white pills rattling into the plastic bag echoed through the room like chains finally breaking apart. For the first time in months, my life belonged to me again. I decided when to eat, when to sleep, and most importantly, I controlled my own yellow blood pressure medication with my own hands. I was no longer a week-old prey waiting for judgment from the son I once adored. And strangely enough, I realized something important. My revenge was never about violence. It was never about hatred. The greatest revenge was surviving. Waking up, taking my life back and continuing to live well despite everything that had happened. I lowered myself into the familiar armchair and made myself a fresh cup of hot coffee. Steam rose slowly into the air, carrying a rich smell through the house. For the first time in a very long while, the silence no longer felt suffocating. I looked out the window toward the hydrangeas outside. After days of neglect, they seemed to be slowly recovering beneath the warm sunlight. I truly believed the nightmare was finally over, that justice had won. But the following morning, when I stepped outside into the yard, I noticed something small hidden beneath the hydrangea bushes. And in that instant, I realized the nightmare was not finished yet. Beneath the hydrangea bushes my late wife once cared for so lovingly, I discovered an old spare key buried deep beneath the soft soil. It was the same key I believed had been lost years ago. That was when I realized something even more chilling. My son had been preparing this plan for a very long time, long before the smart security system was ever installed. This betrayal was not a sudden moment of madness. It was a trap carefully built over years. I slowly sat down on the stone steps and stared at the blue hydrangeas beginning to recover beneath the fresh water I had given them that morning. And for the first time I accepted the cruelest truth of all. Love and destruction can exist inside the same person at the exact same time. My son truly did love me once. I believe that. But illness, fear, and greed twisted that love into something poisonous, something deadly. My story is a warning for anyone listening, because sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are also the ones quietly controlling and destroying you. Please never ignore the small warnings your instincts try to show you. Sometimes a lie told to the world becomes the most honest truth you ever tell yourself. Instinct can become the final lifeline when darkness closes in around you. So pay attention to the moment your heart tells you something is wrong. Listen to it. Follow it, because it might save your life the same way it saved mine. If this story gave you something meaningful to think about, please share it with the people you love and leave a comment below telling me your thoughts. Thank you for walking beside me through this journey of reclaiming my life here on Dad's Real Life Revenge. Do not forget to subscribe and share your own story in the comments so you never miss the next hard lesson life may bring. I'll see you in the next video. I stood up slowly and brushed the dirt from my hands. That morning I made my own coffee. I took my own medication. And for the first time in a very long while, I no longer felt dizzy. The early morning sunlight spread across the yard, warming a soul that had finally survived the storm. I was standing in the grand marble lobby of the five-star hotel called the Cloister. Two massive security guards gripped my shoulders tightly as they dragged me toward the front entrance under the disgusted stares of wealthy guests. My clothes were torn apart. Across my old suit jacket spread a large, dark bloodstain that had already dried. I looked less like a father attending his son's wedding, and more like a criminal who had wandered into a palace by mistake. Across the lobby stood Felicity and Carlton, my son's rich in-laws, staring at me with open contempt. Felicity lifted her hand to cover her nose, as if my mere presence polluted the air around her. My son Bradley stood frozen behind them. He could not even look his own father in the eye. He chose silence to protect the pride of his wife's family. They threw me out because of the blood on my shirt. But they had no idea that blood was worth $9 million they were about to lose. My sons-in-laws had looked down on me my entire life. To them, I was nothing more than a retired water department worker from the bottom of society. They believed their money could buy everything, including human dignity. They were wrong. Exactly 15 minutes later, a powerful woman stepped out of a luxury car and walked into that hotel lobby. The moment she appeared, everyone who had mocked me began to tremble. And what she said to them that night is a story I will tell my grandchildren until the day I die. Welcome back to Dad's Revenge Real Life. Grab yourself a drink, maybe a snack, settle in comfortably, and remember this. The people in these stories always had the chance to do the right thing. They simply chose not to. Subscribe for more intense family drama stories. And before we begin, tell me which state or city you are watching from tonight. Life is strange sometimes. The people who speak the loudest about morality and kindness often carry the darkest hearts. They wear elegant clothes and sparkling diamonds, while their character rots underneath. Meanwhile, true kindness is often hidden beneath worn-out jackets and rough hands stained by years of honest work. This story is not about showing off wealth or power. It is about the price of arrogance and the reward waiting for a compassionate heart. Let me take you back to the beginning of that day. Everything started with a phone call from my son filled with pride and condescension. That morning began with the sharp ringing of a telephone. It shattered the silence inside my small, lonely house. The moment I saw Bradley's name glowing on the screen, my heart tightened painfully. My son had not called home in 3 months. His voice came through the speaker, cold and distant. There was no question about my health. No concern about how his old father had been living lately. He went straight to the point with a hurried tone filled with pressure. Tonight was the 25th wedding anniversary celebration for his wealthy in-laws, the Halverson Beauchamp family. A grand event held at the most luxurious five-star hotel in the city. Bradley hesitated for a few seconds before saying something that made my chest feel heavy. He told me I did not need to dress too formally. A sports jacket would be good enough for me. It sounded like harmless advice. But I understood the real meaning behind those words immediately. It was a quiet insult aimed at my social status. My son was ashamed of me. He feared that my old age and modest appearance would embarrass him in front of his rich wife's family. He was terrified that I might ruin the perfect image he had worked so hard to create. After the call ended, I sat motionless on my worn-out sofa. The house felt unbearably empty. Ever since Helen, my beloved wife, passed away, loneliness had become my only companion. I lifted my eyes toward our wedding photograph hanging on the wall. Helen's gentle smile seemed to comfort me even now. I walked into the kitchen to make a piece of toast. The old toaster suddenly sparked and began burning the bread black while smoke filled the room. The bitter smell spread through the kitchen like the darkness that had settled over my life. I coughed violently and rushed to open the windows wide. Outside, a small cardinal rested on a tree branch. It chirped cheerfully before soaring freely into the open sky. I watched the bird for a long moment before lowering my eyes to my rough, weathered hands. Hands that had spent 38 years working honestly for the city water department. I wondered when honesty and hard work had become something children were ashamed of. The loneliness in my chest rose painfully into my throat. But for Bradley's happiness, I convinced myself to endure it. I walked to my closet and took out the best suit I owned. A black suit with worn shoulders but carefully pressed and spotless. Then I placed $200 of savings into an envelope. It was a small gift meant to honor my sons-in-laws and bless their celebration. I stepped out of my house with a calm heart, completely unaware of what awaited me ahead. I did not know that this journey would drag me into a life or death situation. When 27 luxury cars drove past the accident scene without stopping, only one old Buick pulled over. And that was the moment fate changed everything. What happened on that lonely road that forced me to sacrifice even my dignity? I drove my old Buick toward the anniversary party, but my mind was crowded with bitter memories of my son's wealthy in-laws. The Halverson Beauchamp family lived in a world completely different from mine. Carlton was a famous cosmetic surgeon who catered to the rich and powerful. Felicity spent her days organizing charity galas for royal thoroughbred horses. They owned enormous mansions, attended elite social events, and surrounded themselves with influential people. To them, a retired water department worker like me was nothing more than a stain on their family reputation. Every time our paths crossed, they treated me like an unwanted shadow. My poverty was in their eyes some contagious disease that might infect their polished image. I still remembered the very first time our families met. Felicity looked me up and down with cold judgment in her eyes. Then she stepped closer and lifted one finger covered in diamonds to inspect the collar of my shirt. The gesture was cruel and humiliating, as though she were checking an animal for parasites. She clicked her tongue softly before turning to her daughter and muttering that some people could never hide where they came from, no matter how hard they tried. Carlton stood beside her with a smug half-smile stretched across his face. That day I swallowed every ounce of humiliation for Bradley's future. Tonight felt no different. I knew I was driving straight into a lion's den. I glanced down at my old suit and then toward the envelope containing $200 resting on the passenger seat. That money came from months of careful saving from my tiny pension checks. To those rich people, $200 was probably less than the cost of a single bottle of wine at their celebration. But to me it represented sincerity, respect, and a father's blessing. I kept telling myself that kindness and honesty could bridge any distance between rich and poor. I hoped that if they saw my genuine heart, they might treat Bradley with more respect and compassion. My old Buick rolled slowly down Highway 17, while light rain began falling across the windshield. Thick fog spread over the empty road and blurred everything ahead of me. The highway looked uncertain and dangerous, just like the storm waiting in my future. I turned on the radio to escape the heaviness crushing my chest. But even the soft melody playing through the speakers could not calm the growing sense of dread inside me. I had no idea that only minutes later on this lonely stretch of road something horrifying was about to happen. An event that would test my humanity and expose the true faces of people who called themselves noble. Then suddenly the violent screech of tires echoed through the fog, followed by a deafening explosion in the distance. The explosion ripped through the silence of Highway 17 like thunder tearing open the night sky. I slammed on the brakes, and my old Buick skidded across the rain-soaked pavement. About 50 yards ahead of me, a luxury SUV had flipped onto its side near the ditch. Thick black smoke poured from beneath the crumpled hood, while flames slowly began spreading underneath the vehicle. The headlights pointed upward into the fog, casting weak, trembling beams into the darkness. I threw open my car door and rushed out into the storm. Rain lashed against my face, freezing cold, but I barely felt it. My chest pounded violently with fear. From inside the wreckage came the horrifying screams of a woman crying for help. Her voice cracked with desperation as she shouted that her daughter was still trapped in the back seat. For several seconds I stood frozen. Then I noticed headlights approaching from behind me. One luxury car after another raced down the highway toward the city. They could clearly see the accident. They could hear the screams. Yet not a single car slowed down. The first car sped past. Then the second. The third. The fourth. Every driver pressed harder on the gas, as if terrified that compassion might inconvenience them. They did not want blood or smoke near their expensive cars. They did not want a roadside tragedy to delay their glamorous dinners and private parties. I counted them silently with growing bitterness. 27 luxury cars passed by without stopping. 27 people chose comfort over human life. The cruelty of it sent a chill deeper through me than the rain ever could. At that moment, instinct took over. For 5 years I had cared for my late wife Helen during her epilepsy attacks. I knew what panic looked like. I knew how quickly seconds could become the difference between life and death. If I wasted time now, the SUV could explode, or the child could suffocate from the smoke. I could not stand there like the other 27 selfish strangers. I forgot about my clean-pressed suit. I forgot about the anniversary party. I forgot about the wealthy family waiting to judge me. I ran straight toward the burning vehicle. Mud splashed across my shoes while shattered glass crunched beneath every step. When I reached the back door, I saw it had been twisted completely out of shape. Through the cracked window, I could barely make out a little girl around 5 years old. She was crying weakly, her tiny face pale from fear and lack of oxygen. Her mother, trapped in the front seat, was desperately trying to reach back toward her, but one of her legs was pinned beneath the dashboard. I grabbed the rear door handle with both hands and pulled with every ounce of strength left in my 60-year-old body. Metal shrieked violently beneath my grip, but the door did not move at all. Smoke from the engine poured thicker into the cabin. The little girl started coughing harder. Her cries became weaker and weaker. Below the SUV, the fire suddenly flared brighter, and in that terrifying moment I realized I had only one final chance to save that child before it was too late. I grabbed a large rock from the side of the road and smashed it against the SUV window with all my strength. The glass exploded into thousands of sharp fragments. Without hesitating, I shoved my arm through the broken opening while jagged pieces sliced into my skin. Pain burned through my hand, but I ignored it completely. I reached inside, unlocked the door, and yanked it open with every ounce of strength left in me. Thick, poisonous smoke burst out of the cabin, making me cough violently. I leaned inside the burning vehicle and pulled the little girl into my arms just seconds before flames reached the back seat. Holding her tightly against my chest, I ran nearly 30 feet away from the SUV. The moment I stopped, a small explosion thundered behind us. I gently laid the child down on the rain-soaked grass beside the highway. Without thinking twice, I removed my carefully pressed suit jacket and rolled it into a pillow beneath her head. Her name was Caitlin. She was gasping for breath while her tiny body trembled uncontrollably from fear. Blood from a cut on her forehead mixed with mud and wet grass all over my clothes. My white shirt was now stained with dark blood and dirt. But none of that mattered to me. I held Caitlin's small, trembling hand and spoke to her as softly as I could. I told her everything was all right now. I told her she was safe. Her mother, Genevieve, had finally managed to crawl out through the front door of the SUV. The moment she reached her daughter, she collapsed beside her and wrapped the little girl in her arms while sobbing uncontrollably. She kept thanking me over and over again, between desperate breaths. In the distance, the sound of approaching ambulance sirens cut through the rain. Suddenly, Genevieve remembered something important. She handed me an expensive designer handbag and begged me to hold on to it while she rode with Caitlin to the hospital. She explained that it contained extremely important documents. Then the paramedics rushed them away. I stood alone in the pouring rain, watching the ambulance disappear into the darkness. For a moment, I looked at my reflection in the side mirror of my old Buick. My hair was soaked and disheveled. My clothes were torn apart and covered in mud and blood. I pulled out my phone to check the time, and my stomach dropped instantly. I was already more than an hour late for the anniversary party. Panicked, I climbed back into my Buick and drove straight toward the cloister. I had no idea that my appearance would soon turn me into the center of a horrifying nightmare. I was about to face the cruelest humiliation of my life from the very people who called themselves family. How would those polished, wealthy elites react when a blood-covered old man walked into the middle of their glamorous celebration? I pulled my old Buick up in front of the grand entrance of the cloister. Crystal chandeliers glowed through the massive windows, spilling golden light across the marble driveway like something out of a dream. I stepped out of the car, still holding the stranger's handbag tightly in my hand. The valet attendant looked me up and down with open disgust. He did not even bother walking over to take my keys. Instead, he crossed his arms and loudly demanded that I move my wreck of a car somewhere else before it ruined the appearance of the entrance. I ignored him completely. Without saying a word, I hurried through the revolving glass doors and entered the hotel lobby. The sound of my worn shoes striking the polished marble floor echoed awkwardly through the elegant ballroom. The moment I stepped inside, a chilling silence spread across the room. Even the soft classical music seemed to fade away. Every guest, dressed in designer suits and sparkling gowns, slowly turned to stare at me. Then the whispering began. Cruel whispers. Mocking whispers. They looked at me as if I were some filthy creature that had wandered in from another world to contaminate their perfect evening. I saw fingers pointing toward my blood-stained clothes. I saw smug smiles curling across faces hidden behind champagne glasses. These people called themselves refined and noble, yet their eyes dripped with cruelty, and no one looked more horrified than my sons-in-laws. From across the ballroom, Felicity spotted me, and her face instantly turned bright red with humiliation and rage. The wineglass in her hand trembled violently. She could not believe that her son-in-law's father had dared to appear at her prestigious celebration looking like this. Carlton stormed toward me with fury burning in his eyes. He never once asked if I was hurt. He never asked what had happened. Instead, he grabbed my arm aggressively and squeezed so hard it felt like my bones might crack. He dragged me across the ballroom as if I were a dangerous lunatic being removed from a public place. Bradley followed closely behind us, his face pale with panic. But he said nothing. Not one word to defend his own father. He stood there watching Carlton humiliate me in front of everyone without opening his mouth even once. That silence wounded me more deeply than all the cruelty from strangers. Carlton shoved me into a deserted hallway near the service storage rooms. He stood in front of me like a judge preparing to sentence a criminal. Then he pointed angrily at the bloodstains covering my shirt. What came out of his mouth next would ignite a vicious confrontation that pushed every ounce of pain and humiliation inside me to the breaking point. Carlton stepped closer until his face was only inches from mine. His breath reeked of expensive whiskey. Through clenched teeth, he demanded to know what kind of disgraceful stunt I thought I was pulling. He asked if I had any idea how important this night was for his family. Felicity stormed out into the hallway beside him, crossing her arms tightly over her chest with absolute disgust written across her face. She said I looked like a homeless beggar dragged out of a garbage dump. Then she pointed at the bloodstains covering my shirt and shouted that my filthy appearance was ruining the expensive carpets of the cloister. She proudly announced that the mayor himself and some of the most powerful businessmen in the city were attending tonight's celebration. According to her, the presence of a shabby retired water department worker like me was an insult to everyone in that ballroom. I turned desperately toward Bradley, hoping my son would finally show even a shred of understanding. I explained that there had been an accident on the highway. I told him I had just saved a little girl's life, but Bradley lowered his head in shame. Then he quietly asked why I had not gone home to change clothes before coming to the party. He said I was humiliating him. He said he did not even know how to face his wife's parents anymore because of me. Those words cut through my heart like a knife. I had sacrificed my entire life to raise that boy, and now he was ashamed of the father who gave him everything. Carlton refused to let me explain another word. He snapped his fingers and called over 2 massive hotel security guards. In a cold, furious voice, he ordered them to throw me out immediately. He declared that filthy, poor people like me had no right to breathe the same air as respectable, upper-class guests. The guards grabbed both of my shoulders and dragged me across the lobby while guests gathered near the entrance to watch the humiliation unfold. Some whispered, some laughed. Others stared at me with cruel amusement, as if I were entertainment for the evening. The guards shoved me through the revolving doors so violently that I crashed onto the cold stone steps outside the hotel entrance. The stranger's designer handbag flew from my hands and landed beside me in the pouring rain. If you feel furious for Mr. Hollis right now, leave a like and comment the number 1 to support kindness and humanity. I sat alone on the wet stone steps beneath the heavy rain. Water streamed down my face, mixing with tears of humiliation and heartbreak. I could not stop asking myself when kindness had become a crime. How could a man who had just saved a child's life be treated like a criminal by his own family? I stared at the expensive handbag lying abandoned beside me. Part of me wanted to stand up, get back into my old Buick, and drive away forever without ever seeing my cowardly son again. But the moment my fingers touched the handle of the bag, the sharp scream of brakes echoed across the entrance driveway. A black Rolls-Royce stopped directly in front of the hotel. The rear door slowly opened, and a powerful woman stepped out into the rain. That single moment was about to change everything and ignite a devastating reckoning none of them would ever forget. The woman stepped out of the black Rolls-Royce with urgency written all over her face. It was Genevieve Ashworth. Her designer dress was still stained with rainwater and mud from the accident scene. Though worry clouded her expression, her presence radiated the unmistakable authority of someone used to commanding entire rooms with a single glance. The moment she saw me sitting on the freezing stone steps in torn, blood-stained clothes, she stopped abruptly. Shock flashed across her face before turning into cold fury, as she noticed the 2 security guards still standing nearby, watching me like a dangerous criminal. Genevieve hurried toward me without hesitation. She bent down and personally helped me to my feet. Then she picked up her handbag and carefully supported my arm with genuine respect. Her voice trembled with disbelief as she asked why the man who had saved her granddaughter's life was sitting outside in the rain like this. I remained silent. I only looked through the glass doors toward the ballroom inside. At that exact moment, Felicity and Carlton rushed out of the hotel entrance, eager to welcome their wealthy, distinguished guest. They had assumed Genevieve Ashworth arrived to attend their anniversary celebration, but the moment they saw her standing beside me, their arrogant smiles disappeared instantly. Their faces turned pale. Carlton quickly tried to explain himself. Stammering nervously, he claimed that I was merely some unstable homeless man who had sneaked into the party and caused trouble. He insisted they had removed me only to protect the safety and dignity of the guests. Felicity immediately joined in, saying my filthy appearance would have contaminated the entire evening. Genevieve did not even let them finish speaking. She turned sharply toward them, her eyes colder than steel. Then she tightened her grip on my arm and delivered a sentence that struck them like lightning. She announced that this so-called filthy old man had risked his own life to pull her granddaughter from a burning vehicle, while 27 other luxury cars drove past without stopping. Silence crashed over the entrance. Without another word, Genevieve guided me back toward the grand ballroom of the cloister. The same two security guards who had thrown me out moments earlier now lowered their heads in shame, too terrified to say a single word. Felicity and Carlton followed behind us with trembling steps. The full weight of Genevieve Ashworth's identity was finally beginning to settle over the room. She was not an ordinary woman. She was the largest diamond-level donor behind the International Medical Center project Carlton desperately wanted attached to his name and career. And now the most satisfying reckoning imaginable was about to unfold in front of 300 wealthy guests standing frozen inside the ballroom. What would Genevieve Ashworth do next to expose the true faces hiding behind all that luxury and prestige? Genevieve Ashworth led me straight into the center of the magnificent ballroom. The moment we entered, all 300 wealthy guests fell completely silent. Every eye in the room locked onto the most powerful woman in the city, walking beside an old man covered in blood, mud, and torn clothing. Behind us, Carlton and Felicity followed like ghosts. Their faces had gone completely pale. Genevieve climbed onto the stage and took hold of the microphone. Her voice rang through the grand ballroom, sharp, powerful, and impossible to ignore. She announced to every guest present that Mr. Hollis was the greatest benefactor the Ashworth family could ever ask for. She declared that I had risked my own life to save her granddaughter Caitlin from a vehicle moments away from exploding, while 27 luxury cars chose to drive past and ignore a dying child. A wave of shocked whispers spread across the room. Then Genevieve slowly turned toward Carlton and Felicity. The disgust in her eyes was unmistakable. In front of everyone, she publicly canceled the entire $9 million donation intended for Carlton's new international hospital project. Her words struck like hammers against their pride. She said the people hoping to carve their names into a hospital building possessed hearts far too ugly to deserve such honor. A cosmetic surgeon who constantly preached beauty and compassion had just thrown out a kind old father because of bloodstains on his shirt. A woman who spent fortunes rescuing thoroughbred horses had valued a luxury hotel carpet more than the life of a frightened little girl. Money, she said, could build beautiful towers and elegant foundations, but it could never purchase humanity. The ballroom erupted into whispers once again, but this time the whispers were filled with shame and disgust toward the Halverson Beauchamp family. Guests quietly stepped farther away from Carlton and Felicity as though humiliation itself were contagious. Carlton stood frozen on the stage, his lips trembling helplessly. The reputation and prestige he had spent decades building collapsed around him in a single night. Felicity covered her face while tears streamed down her cheeks as the same judgmental eyes she once used against others now turned mercilessly upon her. Every layer of their polished fake image had been ripped apart beneath the bright ballroom lights. From the corner of the room, Bradley stared at me with overwhelming shame and regret burning in his eyes. Seeing that late realization inside my son made me release a quiet, exhausted sigh. Whitney stepped beside him and gently held his hand. Then Bradley slowly walked toward me, before lowering his head in apology. He admitted he had been weak, selfish, and blinded by fear of losing status and approval. At that moment, Bradley and Whitney chose to leave the luxurious celebration behind and stand beside me instead. They turned their backs on empty prestige and chose kindness over arrogance. Genevieve smiled warmly at the three of us and announced that her Rolls-Royce was waiting outside to take us to dinner. Together, we walked out of the cloister with our heads held high while the Halverson Beauchamp family remained trapped inside the ruins of their shattered reputation. The elite society they worshipped had already begun abandoning them completely. Justice had finally arrived for those who looked down on human dignity. It should have been the perfect ending. But later that night, during a simple, humble dinner far away from the glittering ballroom, an unexpected moment would heal wounds inside my heart that I believed could never recover. What was the surprise that finally brought peace back to a broken father's soul? The Rolls-Royce finally stopped in front of a small roadside diner glowing beneath dim yellow lights. Inside, the soft clatter of silverware and the comforting smell of simple homemade food slowly washed away the tension of the terrible night behind us. We gathered around an old wooden table near the window. Bradley looked at me with red, swollen eyes filled with shame and regret. Then my son gently took my rough, weathered hands into his own and offered the most sincere apology I had ever heard from him. For the first time in years, I could see that Bradley had truly awakened. The storm of humiliation and heartbreak had forced him to understand something priceless. All the wealth, prestige, and glamorous status in the world could never compare to the love of family and the dignity of a good heart. At that moment, Genevieve's phone rang softly. A bright, cheerful voice burst through the speaker. It was little Caitlin. She had fully regained consciousness and wanted to personally thank Grandpa Hollis for saving her life. Genevieve smiled warmly before showing me a photograph Caitlin had drawn from her hospital bed. The picture was messy and uneven, like most children's drawings, but to me, it looked more valuable than any masterpiece in the world. In the drawing, an old man wearing a black suit stood with his arms stretched wide, protecting a little girl from danger. I stared at that picture for a long, quiet moment. No medal, no fortune, no grand award could ever mean more to me than that child's innocent gratitude. Outside the diner window, pale streetlights flickered softly through the rain. I leaned back in my chair and smiled for what felt like the first time in years. Life has a strange way of balancing itself. Character is not built inside luxurious ballrooms or behind expensive designer clothes. True character is revealed in darkness when nobody is watching. It appears in the moment when you must choose between driving past suffering or stopping to help another human being in need. People like Felicity and Carlton spent their lives measuring human worth through money and social status. In the end, all their wealth left them empty and alone. But kindness given from a sincere heart always finds its way back home eventually. Never be ashamed of hard-working hands. Keep being kind even when the world tries to convince you that kindness is weakness. Click the video on the left to hear another unforgettable story filled with heartbreak, justice, and redemption. Tonight, the mud on my hands and the bloodstains on my clothes became proof that my life had truly meant something. Because when all the luxury disappears and every light finally goes dark, character is the only thing you carry with you through the final door. So tell me honestly, would you rather become a humble Hollis with a good heart or a glamorous Felicity with an empty soul? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. My story ends here tonight. Dad's Revenge Real Life thanks you for listening and staying with me until the very end. May you always protect the goodness inside your heart, no matter how cruel the world becomes. Most people are afraid of coming home to an empty house. I came home early, and I wish to God the house had actually been empty. Welcome to Dad's True Life Revenge. Grab a snack, get comfortable, because this isn't the kind of story you can pause halfway through to make tea. And if you've ever had that feeling, that strange, hard to explain sense that something isn't right, not because you saw it, but because you felt it, like a scent in the air that doesn't belong there, then you know exactly what I mean. 23 years of marriage. 23 years of sharing a bed, a bank account, and a bathroom. Trust me, the bathroom is the real test of love. After that long, you develop something I can only describe as a sixth sense. You know when the other person is sad even when they're smiling. You know something's wrong before there's any proof. That afternoon I knew. From the moment I turned onto my street, I wasn't supposed to be there. My business trip to Denver ended a day early. Officially, the keynote speaker had a personal emergency. Unofficially, maybe he looked out at the audience and lost his faith in humanity. Either way, I caught the earliest flight home. No call. No text. I wanted it to be a surprise. Maybe I'd pick up Cassandra's favorite Thai food. Maybe for the first time in months we'd have dinner without a laptop sitting between us like a third person. I was in a good mood. That should have been my first warning. The first thing I noticed was the car. Preston's car. My son. 26, married with a perfectly decent apartment, one I helped furnish. So seeing his car parked in front of my house on a Tuesday afternoon wasn't strange. It was wrong. Completely wrong. I sat in my car for a few seconds staring at it, then said out loud, "Warren, why is your son's car here right now?" No answer. The second thing I noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind where people are just relaxing. This was heavy silence. The kind that makes the air feel thicker than it should be. I opened the door and stepped inside. And in that moment, everything changed. If you've made it this far, do me a small favor. Hit subscribe. Seriously. A lot of people watch but never do, and it costs you nothing, but it means more than you think. Thank you. Because what happened next was the moment I realized I wasn't the only one who knew something was wrong. Preston and Lindsay were sitting on the couch, together. And here's the part that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. They weren't watching TV, they weren't on their phones. They were just sitting there, like two people in a waiting room. The kind who've already accepted whatever news is coming. Preston looked up first, and I need you to pay very close attention to this detail. He wasn't surprised to see me. Think about that for a second. Your father is supposed to be in Denver. He's not due back for another day. And suddenly he walks through the front door, unannounced. And you don't react. No flinch, no question, no natural expression at all. Just a slow blink, and a look I can only describe as calculated. Lindsay smiled, and I'm telling you that smile had no business existing that afternoon. I set my bag down. I asked Pri, "What's going on? Where's your mother?" Preston cleared his throat. "Dad, we were just about to call you." I looked at him. "Really?" I didn't ask. I stated it. He gave a small nod. "Mom had an episode this morning," he said. "She's at Mercy General now. She's stable." I didn't hear anything after Mercy General. Everything else got cut off like someone muted the sound inside my head. I turned around. 11 seconds later I was in the car. I know that sounds like a strange number, but shocked as that. It makes you remember meaningless details, while the important things try to tear you apart from the inside. I called Kurt on the way. Curtis Barnes. My best friend since 1987. He's seen me through everything: marital problems, 2 recessions, and the disaster that was my attempt to grow a beard in 2009. If there's anyone in this world who will tell me the truth without sugarcoating it, it's Kurt. He picked up on the second ring. "Warren, what's going on?" "Cassandra's in the hospital," I said. "Mercy General." I just got home and Preston and Lindsay were sitting in the living room like they already knew how the movie ends. Silence. On the other end, then Kurt said, "What do you mean, knew how it ends?" "My son didn't react when I walked in," I said. "I'm supposed to be in Denver." Another pause. Then very quietly he said, "Warren, you need to stay calm." "I am calm," I said. "No," he replied. "You're driving. That's not the same thing." He wasn't wrong. Mercy General is 15 minutes from my house. I made it in 9. I will not be answering any questions about that. When I walked into the hospital, I knew one thing. That feeling I had standing at my front door. It didn't go away. It came with me. And now, it was bigger, heavier, sharper. It wasn't a hunch anymore. It was a warning. Dr. Beverly Nash met me at the nurses' station, a woman in her 50s, steady voice, unshaken eyes. I liked that. Right now, I needed stability more than anything. "Mr. Trevor," she said, "I'm glad you're here. Your wife was brought in this morning by your son." She paused just long enough for me to keep up. "She's showing signs of severe disorientation. Her organs are under stress. And there are elevated levels of toxicity in her blood." Toxicity. I repeated the word like I could understand it better if I slowed it down. She nodded. "We're running more tests, but I want to be direct with you. The pattern we're seeing doesn't match a sudden illness." Another pause. "It suggests something cumulative." Cumulative. That word hit like a silent punch. I placed my hand on the counter, trying to keep my voice level. "Doctor, are you telling me something has been introduced into my wife's system?" She didn't answer right away. She looked straight at me. "I'm saying we need answers. And I believe you do too." I walked into the room, and I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. I've seen Cassandra in a lot of states. Laughing so hard she couldn't breathe. Angry enough to make me rethink every decision I've ever made. Exhausted. Radiant. Broken. But I had never seen her like this. She looked drained. Like someone had found a switch inside her and slowly turned down everything that made her, her. Machines hummed in steady rhythm. An IV dripped quietly. And the woman who once chased a contractor out of our house with a wooden spoon for cutting corners was lying there. Small. I sat beside her, took her hand. It was colder than I expected. I leaned in and said softly, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere until I know exactly what happened to you." I'm not a man who makes promises lightly. But when I do, I keep them. I stepped back outside. Preston and Lindsay were in the waiting area. Of course they were. Preston stood up. Dad, we need to talk. There are things you don't. I raised my hand. Just once. He stopped mid-sentence. There must have been something on my face in that moment. I don't know what it was. But it was enough. I said not now. Then I turned away. Walked to the corner of the waiting room. Sat down. Took out my phone. And did the one thing they never expected me to do. I started locking everything down. Every account. Every access point. Every single thing they could touch. One by one I shut it all off. And when the notifications started lighting up their phones, I looked at Lindsay first. That smile. That out-of-place smile. Gone. In a single second. And right then I knew. We weren't having a conversation anymore. We were in a war. And I had just kicked a hornet's nest. The only question left was how many hornets were inside. There's something you need to understand about denial. It isn't loud. It doesn't knock on your door and shout that something is wrong. It's more polite than that. It sits across from you, pours you a cup of coffee, and tells you everything is fine. That you're overthinking. That you're tired. That the people you love couldn't possibly do the things your instincts are screaming about. I lived with denial longer than I care to admit. But that night, sitting in the hospital parking lot at 9:43 p.m., with Cassandra somewhere above me hooked to machines, and Preston's expression replaying in my head, I got rid of it, permanently. Changed the locks. Threw away the key. I called Kurt. He picked up immediately. Talk to me, he said. She looks bad, Kurt, I said. And my voice betrayed me on that last word. The doctor mentioned toxicity. Said it's been building. Not sudden. I heard him exhale slowly. Then he said, Warren, building means intentional. I know, I said. And Preston and Lindsay were at the house. They're in the waiting room right now. Silence. Then Kurt said something I will never forget. You need to think very carefully about who's had access to Cassandra's food, drinks, and medication every day for the past few months. A pause. Who's been there? And then, it hit. Not a sound you hear, the kind you feel. 4 months ago, Cassandra twisted her ankle coming down the stairs. Nothing serious, but enough for Preston to step in. Almost immediately. He suggested Lindsay come by every morning, help Cassandra with breakfast, her medication, keep an eye on things while I was at work. At the time, I thought it was care. I even told Kurt maybe I'd misjudged the kid. If I could go back to that moment, I'd do something very simple. I'd slap myself. I went back to the waiting room. Preston was standing near the vending machine, arms crossed, trying to look innocent, failing, spectacularly. Lindsay was sitting down, her phone face down on her lap, and you need to understand this, Lindsay never puts her phone down. I've seen her scroll during holiday prayers. So a phone placed face down. That's not a habit. That's strategy. I sat across from them. Preston spoke first. Dad, I know how this looks. I looked at him. Do you? Tell me how you think it looks. He shifted. Mom's had health issues for a while. We've just been helping. Lindsay comes every morning to make sure she eats and takes her vitamins. Vitamins? I repeated it. 3 supplements, he said. Which ones? I asked. He blinked. I said it again. Which ones? He looked at Lindsay. Lindsay looked down. 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds. But enough. Enough for me to not need another answer. I stood up. You two go home, I said. Dad, Preston started. I said his name once. Quiet. But enough. Go home. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Because at that point I didn't have doubts anymore. I knew. And once you know, everything changes. The only question left was how far they'd gone. I sat alone in the waiting room with a cup of hospital coffee, and calling it coffee was already being generous. The clock read 2:00 a.m., and I started doing what any reasonable man would do when he suspects his own son might be poisoning his wife. I started digging, layer by layer, detail by detail. I opened the banking app, the last 6 months. I'm not an accountant. I don't even like online banking, but even I could see it. Something wasn't right. Small withdrawals. $200. $250, $202, numbers that don't draw attention, they don't shout, they whisper. But when you add them up, they tell a different story. $11,000 in 5 months. From our joint account, mine and Cassandra's, the account Preston had access to for emergencies. $11,000. I stared at that number for a long time. Then I called Kurt. He picked up like he'd been waiting. 11,000, I said. No greeting. No build-up. From which account, he asked. The joint one. Small withdrawals. Regular. Deliberate. Kurt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Warren, this isn't impulsive. This is a plan. Someone sat down and figured out how to not get caught. I closed my eyes. Just for a second. Then I said, my son. Those 2 words. I never thought I'd say them like that. In that context. Kurt spoke carefully. We're not completely certain yet. I said no. I know. Silence. Heavy. The kind you don't just hear, you feel it pressing against your ribs. Then Kurt said, Warren, I need you to prepare yourself. You think 11,000 is the problem, but I have a feeling. There's something much bigger behind it. And this is the part you need to remember. Kurt was about to find something that would make $11,000 look like pocket change. And it would change everything. If you've made it this far, do me a small favor. Hit subscribe. Seriously, so many people watch but never do. It costs you nothing, but it means more than you think. Thank you. Because what happened next wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't just about suspicion anymore. It was about realizing the person you trusted most might have been planning something you couldn't even bring yourself to imagine. I leaned back in the chair, stared up at the hospital ceiling. Cold white lights. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. And for the first time in hours, I wasn't wondering if I was right. I started wondering what I was still missing. The next morning, Kurt called me at 7:14. I remember the exact time, because I was staring at the clock, watching every minute crawl by waiting to be allowed in to see Cassandra. He didn't say hello. He went straight in. Warren, you need to prepare yourself. I didn't stand. I sat down, set my coffee aside. Go on. 6 weeks before Cassandra was admitted, she met with an attorney about her will. Alone. She didn't tell you. I closed my eyes. That part wasn't unusual. Cassandra liked surprises. She planned everything. Birthdays, anniversaries. Even dinner could feel like a military operation. But what Kurt said next that changed everything. She updated her insurance policy. The old one, Preston, was the secondary beneficiary. Standard. You set that up years ago. But Cassandra changed it. She removed Preston completely and transferred the full benefit to a charitable foundation. One she's been quietly building for the past 2 years. The policy value $2.3 million. I didn't say anything. Not because I had nothing to say, but because everything suddenly connected, like pieces of a puzzle snapping into place. Preston knew. I don't know how, but he knew. He knew his mother was about to erase his name from $2.3 million. And instead of calling her, instead of asking, instead of doing anything a normal person would do, he sat down with his wife and made a decision. Make sure Cassandra didn't live long enough to finalize the paperwork. 30 days. The attorney had a 30-day processing window, and Cassandra had exactly 30 days. I sat there, in the waiting room, not moving, not thinking, just letting the full weight of that truth settle on me. $11,000 was never the goal, just the opening move. If you've made it this far, and you think this story has already gone far enough, believe me, it goes further. If you want more stories like this, hit like and subscribe. It really helps. Thank you. I stood up, straightened my jacket, took a deep breath, and made a decision. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to give them even a second to prepare. I was going to do the one thing they never thought I could do. I was going to be patient. I called my lawyer, Margaret Holloway, 30 years of experience, a voice that didn't need volume to command silence. I told her everything, the money, the vitamins, the insurance, the timeline. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Don't touch anything in the house. Don't talk to them. Don't post anything. Don't hint at anything." "Can you do that?" "I can," I said. "Good," she replied. "Because when this unfolds, it will unfold completely. No way out." I asked, "I want them to feel every part of it." She said, "Trust me. They will feel every square inch." For the first time in hours, I almost smiled. Almost. Because now this wasn't suspicion anymore. This was a plan. And me. The next 72 hours were the longest of my life. Not because nothing was happening, but because too much was happening all at once. Cassandra started to stabilize. Dr. Nash said the treatment was working. Her kidney function was improving. And on the second day she opened her eyes, looked at me, and said in a weak voice that still somehow carried its edge, "Warren, you look terrible." I laughed. A real laugh. Right there in the ICU. The nurse looked at me, like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had lost a piece of it. But hearing Cassandra speak like that again, that familiar sharpness I'd lived with for 23 years, it was like someone flipped a switch back on inside my chest. I took her hand. "You're safe," I said. "Everything's being handled." She looked at me, longer than usual, then said very quietly, "It's Preston, isn't it?" Not a question. A conclusion. I didn't answer. I just tightened my grip on her hand. She closed her eyes again. "You know," she murmured, "I always thought he got the worst parts of me, and none of the good ones." Even like that, Cassandra still saw more clearly than anyone else. By the fourth day, Margaret called. Her tone hadn't changed, but the content had. "Warren, we have enough." Kurt had done his work. Security footage from a pharmacy 2 towns over. 3 purchases. Same supplement each time. Always paid in cash. Always alone. Except the third time, Lindsay sat in the car, waiting. That supplement contained a compound. Taken over time in small doses, tasteless. It created exactly the toxicity pattern Dr. Nash had identified. Margaret continued, "We have bank statements. We have the money trail. We have access logs. And here's the part you'll appreciate." Preston called the attorney's office. Pretended to be Cassandra's assistant. Asked about the status of the policy change. He left a number. His own. I was silent. 10 seconds. Then I said, "Kurt, did I raise a criminal mastermind? Or an idiot?" Kurt replied. "Both. And that's the problem. If you've made it this far, you already know where this is going. But trust me, how it happens is what you'll remember. Hit subscribe. Stay until the end. Because this is where things start getting paid for." Day 5, they came to the hospital. Together. Carrying flowers. Flowers. I looked at that bouquet and realized some people don't understand irony until it's standing right in front of them. Preston walked in, smiling. "Dad, how's Mom doing? We've been so worried." I looked at him, then at Lindsay, then back again. "She's awake," I said. "She's talking, and she's going to make a full recovery." I saw it. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not relief, not happiness. Calculation. Quick, cold. Lindsay said, "That's wonderful news." I nodded, then said, "The police are on their way." No raised voice, no drama. Just a sentence. Like I was commenting on the weather. The color drained from Preston's face so fast it was almost impressive. "What Margaret filed everything this morning," I said. "The footage. The bank records. The calls. The toxicology. All of it. Neatly packaged." Lindsay made a sound, not a word. "Just the moment a person loses control." Preston started, "Dad, just listen." I cut him off. "No. There isn't a sentence in this language that can explain what you did. So don't." I glanced at the flowers, then said, "Nice bouquet. Cassandra will love them. From someone else." They were arrested right there in the hospital parking lot. I stood by the window looking down. Everything unfolded exactly the way Margaret said it would. No shouting, no chaos. Just 2 uniformed officers walking up a few quiet words, and then the handcuffs. Preston tried to say something. He always believed words were his strongest weapon. This time they didn't work. Lindsay stayed silent. The calculated kind of silence. like she was already one move ahead, thinking about deals, thinking about reduced sentences. Kurt was standing next to me. I didn't even notice when he arrived. He's always been like that. Shows up when it matters. He asked, "How do you feel?" I thought for a moment. Then I told the truth. Like I've aged 10 years in 5 days. Like I want to sleep for a month. Like I've lost something I'm never getting back. I paused. Then added, "But also, like this is the first time in my life I'm completely certain about something." Kurt nodded. "What about Cassandra?" I turned back toward the hallway. Through the small window of her room I could see her. Small, but still there. "Cassandra's going to be fine," I said. "She always is. She's the strongest person I know, and she chose to marry me. That alone proves she can survive anything." Kurt laughed. A real laugh. Light, short, but enough to take some weight out of the air. 3 months later, Cassandra walked back into the house. A Saturday morning. Golden light spilling through the hallway. She stood there looking around like she was taking inventory of everything she almost lost. Then she turned to me and said, "Warren, the kitchen needs repainting." I looked at her, then at the wall, then back at her. "No chance," I said. "I just painted it 2 years ago." She pointed. "That's not white," she said. "That's the color of an administrative apology." I looked again, then picked up my phone and called a painter. "If you've come this far with me, you've seen everything. But there's one thing you should take with you. You can't control what people become in the dark. You can only control what you do when the lights come on. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, join us. Hit like, subscribe. Because stories like this, they're not just about revenge. They're about truth. And what we do when we finally see it." The trial lasted 11 days. 11 days of hearing everything again. Every detail. Every piece of evidence. Every cold decision replayed in front of everyone. I sat there, next to Cassandra, her hand in mine steady, firm, as if what happened hadn't broken her. Margaret stood across the room, calm, precise. Not a single wasted word. She didn't need drama. The truth was heavy enough. Pharmacy footage, bank records, toxicology reports, the impersonated phone call. Each piece on its own just a fragment. But put together, it wasn't suspicion anymore. It was a map, a plan, clear, calculated, intentional. Preston sat there in a suit I once paid for, staring straight ahead. Not at me, not at Cassandra. Lindsay was different. She kept looking around, assessing, measuring, like she was still searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. The jury stepped out. The room went quiet. A familiar kind of silence, but this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't frightening. It was just waiting. 4 hours later they came back. I didn't stand. I didn't need to. When things are that clear, you don't question the ending. The judge read the verdict. Guilty. Both of them. Conspiracy. Attempted murder. Financial fraud. The words landed not fast, not slow, just certain. I didn't look at Preston. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't need to. That moment wasn't about him anymore. It was about Cassandra. She squeezed my hand, tighter, like steel. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "I want Thai food." I turned to her. Now she opened her eyes, looked at me and said, "I've been thinking about Thai food for 3 months, Warren. Don't test me." I nodded. "All right." We stood up, walked out of the courtroom, left everything behind. If you've come this far, you've already seen what matters most. Not the verdict, not the crime, but what comes after. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit like and subscribe. Because the one thing I want you to remember isn't what they did, it's what we survived. And this story didn't end in the courtroom. It ended where it began. At home. I told you from the very beginning I came home early, and I wished that house had been empty. I was wrong. I'm glad I came home. I'm glad I walked through that door. And if you think that was just luck, it wasn't. That was the moment the light came on. And when the light comes on, you don't get to look away. You have to see. You have to face it. You have to decide what you're going to do next. 3 months later, we were sitting around a table. Cassandra, Kurt, Margaret, Dr. Nash. Everyone was laughing, talking. Cassandra was telling one long story, waving her hands around like she had never spent a day in intensive care. And I looked at her, not because I'd never looked before, but because this time I understood the value of being able to. There are things in life you assume will always be there until you almost lose them. Family, trust, safety. And when those things break, they don't always break loudly. Sometimes they break in silence, one piece at a time. That was the first lesson. Do not ignore small signs. The details you keep talking yourself into believing don't matter, because sometimes those small things are the very things trying to save you. The second lesson: don't let denial become your shelter. The truth does not disappear just because you refuse to look at it. It just waits. And when it comes back, it usually brings consequences with it. And the last lesson: you cannot control what other people become in the dark, but you can control how you respond when the light comes on. You can choose action, choose truth, choose to protect what matters. If you are in a situation where your instincts are telling you something is wrong, don't stay silent. Don't wait. Look closer. Ask more questions. And if necessary, act sooner. Because I came home just one day early. One day. And that day saved my wife's life. If you stayed with me all the way to the end, thank you, truly. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, join our community. Hit like, subscribe, because here we don't just tell stories. We talk about what happens inside families in the dark, and in the moments when everything changes, and maybe the next story will be the one you need to hear at exactly the right time.